Hey, Johnny, nice to talk with you. I'm glad that Adam hooked this up.
Same here, Don.
So,
Pleasure being with you.
yeah. I mean, Syria has been an interesting case, horror for the Syrian people and for a lot of people in the area, and that impacts almost globally. With some big power geopolitics playing out there, both with the introduction of the armed groups of terrorist gangs that have been conducting a war against the country for 5 years, and also with the entry of Russia, the shoot down by a NATO member of a Russian plane, all kinds of scary moments. And now they're at the peace table. There's still many contradictions, but humanitarian aid is getting to some folks, and there seems to be some stability to the situation, at least from the point of view of the government.
Absolutely. And more power to the people, to be honest with you. I think this is probably one war that I would say the people of Syria, helped with the peace-loving people around the world, were able to actually win over the world bankers and over the world superpowers. Glad to see people are on a peace table, not back behind bunkers. Could have gone the other way easily. The West, led by the United States, wanted to see it going the other way. Many attempts from early on in the conflict was heading that route. We started with the humanitarian crisis, where they created mass exodus, fake mass exodus toward Turkey. Early on, before the crisis even started, those tents were built up in the borders with Turkey. They were trying to, of course, to do a no-fly zone like they did with Libya. That didn't fly. They went to the massacres. They started committing those massacres and blaming the Syrian government for it. We've had sanctions, embassies closed down, especially after the Hula massacre, something that the Syrian government or the Syrian people had no clue what was going on. Of course, after investigation by independent reporters that went in, was obviously all the make of the same type of people that the United States was insisting that they didn't exist in Syria. From day one, the United States and the West insisted there was no terrorist groups, that there was no arms, that this is the Syrian government committing crime and genocide against its people, something the Syrian people never believed because we lived it, we were living there. So that second pretext to war with the crimes, luckily with the help of Russia and China at the time, we avoided an all-out war against Syria. And of course, August 2013, after the another pretext, the sarin attack, and I'm sure you know well about it. I was in Damascus at the time visiting, and it was all played out. Another great pretext for war, as the Syrian government was waiting on the UN inspectors to come and inspect another attack that happened 4 months earlier, that the Syrian government have complained to the United Nations that the rebel forces or the terrorist groups have used sarin against civilians in a town near Aleppo. Finally, we got the teams to come in 4 months later, after Cara del Ponte, an independent team from the UN, already conducted a preliminary investigation, found out that was the rebels, not the Syrian government, who have used that primitive type of sarin chemical bombs. The team arrives to Damascus on August 20th, only to hear that August 21st, the same Syrian government who brought in this team now decided to carry out another sarin gas against its own people 5 miles away from where the government lives. It's just another pretext that almost actually went up in flame. And then luckily we were in Syria and the whole world got involved. And I want to give big thanks to the American people. I think this is the first time they go into action for many, many years before we started the page book. I was on TV. Every activist got on Facebook, and over 4 million emails and phone calls hit all those all the senators and congressmen that were not sure which way to vote. And we tilted this to a point where obviously they decided not to vote and not to go to war. So it's one pretext after another after another. Of course, now they go to the final and best pretext, which we know that Bush used it in Iraq, which is pretext of world war on terror. It worked for Bush, and Obama thought, let's do it the same way, created this monster ISIS. We know ISIS has been around from day one almost in different names, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Muslim Brotherhood, or the Salafists, which you probably know, and now the American public should know because the report has been declassified where it was actually classified, that the intelligence reports since back in 2012 had indicated, and this report was actually passed around from the SCIA to the FBI to the White House. So everyone looked at this report, that all forces fighting against the Assad regime and against the Syrian army were extremists, were Salafist background, were Muslim Brotherhood, were Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That there was no peace-loving, moderate people fighting or killing in Syria, that they were all, and it was going to lead to Islamic State in the eastern part of Syria. That report was available in 2012. The United States knew about it and let it happen because they felt this is the only way they're gonna get rid of the Assad regime. So it all comes down to a regime change. So now that last pretext, a war on terror, we saw the United States and its allies carry out what they call the coalition against ISIS, 15 months of nonsense bombing, 15 months of we don't know what the hell the United States is doing. All we know is that the ISIS is growing its territory in Syria and the Syrian army is losing ground. 15 months, Obama's talking about it's going to take 5 years and 10 years and hundreds and billions of dollars. Something I don't understand why 100,000 guys running around in the desert, we cannot get rid of them. Until, of course, August 30th, when, or September 30th, 2015, when the Syrian government asked the Russian for help. It was not an intervention like the Americans did, a coalition that was without the permission of the Syrian forces. It was actually this time, one was not intervention, it was a participation by the Syrian, by the Russian, based on a Syrian request. And sure enough, Russia showed the world that you really want to fight these people, I'll show you how to fight them with the Syrian army on the ground. And I want to give credit to the Syrian army because bombing from the air, yes, it helped, but the major gains were done by the Syrian forces and the government forces. And they took back some of these towns. They freed some of these people that had been under this horrible rules for the last year or two or three. And then we're moving forward. Hopefully that tilt in the balance made the United States feel that it was already been caught up in this toxic contradictions, which trying to, the scheme of changing regime is done. Finally, I think the United States government has realized, and the bankers, the world bankers have realized, it's time to, realize that we bet against the wrong guy. We better take our losses and run. Now it's time to end this, and hopefully, there's serious efforts to end this crisis in Syria, and we can have peace again.
The scenario that played out there that they started with back in 2011 was very similar to the Libyan scenario. They had the terrorists as the foot soldiers. They were planning to use the U.S. Air Force and NATO Air Forces as the air cover, and the navies for their, cruise missile attacks, etc., from the water. Mm-hmm. And under the cover of a no-fly zone, which is what they did in Libya, and that was where Russia and China said no, and they continuously pushed for this no-fly zone, and have still been doing that, actually. And even with, before the Russians came, it was September 30th when they came, the Syrian Arab army and the armed Syrian people, in many instances, fought off and protected the cities of the country successfully. And it shows that the decisive factor in Libya was most likely the Air Force, and essentially the regime change was accomplished at the point of a NATO gun. Absolutely.
This whole Arab Spring is nothing but a fake. It's a regime changes. Let's just talk in simple terms for our listeners to hear us out, please. This whole attempt from back in '91, from the first Iraqi war, the end of the Cold War. The 100,000 GIs in Western Germany has to go somewhere. Okay, we can't bring them home. The economy is not doing well. Let's create a war somewhere. We all know this. They send them to Saudi Arabia. They created the fiasco. Saddam is the killer. We need to have. Next thing you know, all the jihad goes to the Middle East. We create bases in the Middle East. We start selling weapons. The economy recover.
Right.
Bankers control the politicians. You and I know this. And when bankers feel it's time for a war, the orders are given and the war is carried out. That's what happened. And back in 91, it repeated itself after September 11. We have a big army. We have another reason now to go, conquer some countries, do some regime changes. We want to change this and that. Libya, Somalia, Sudan, then Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and, finally Iran, which it was going well until, they hit in Iraq. It was a much bigger hole than they thought it was going to be.
Yeah,
now,
and you know what? Let's stop there for a minute, and we're going to take a break for 1 second, and we'll be right back.
Sounds good.
Okay, so, Johnny, let's pick it up with the U.S. finding that taking and absorbing Iraq was not going to be the simple task that it was presented as.
Absolutely. That mission accomplished, never accomplished until today. It was never accomplished. All they did in Iraq was turn this beautiful country, safe country, stable country, into a war zone where it's endless. They started, there was no Al-Qaeda. If you want to think where the Al-Qaeda existed really in very minute places. Now as Al-Qaeda was getting a feeding ground in Iraq, it became much, much stronger, much bigger. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq that was spilled over to Syria and became the Islamic State of Iraq and now the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. So all the United States did by destabilizing these countries, destabilizing this regime, is create chaos. And this is the goal. You create chaos, you create hotspots, you can sell weapons. We all know that when you sell a lot of weapons, a lot of people gain, and mainly the bankers around the world. The IMF and the World Banks could not sit and watch some or any kind of autonomies or sovereign nations, small self-determining nations like Syria or Iraq succeed. Syria was probably one of very few countries that didn't owe any money to World Banks. None, zero. It was self-sufficient, had zero debt. And that's not good, because if you don't need them, then they cannot get their plans. Obviously, and I've said it from day one of this crisis, from day one, that the reason there is a war in Syria or a war on Syria, or the reason to change, people ask me why they want to overthrow the Assad government. He's good to his people. He's done great things for Syria. Yes, of course he's done, but he hasn't done anything for the West. They needed to build a natural gas pipeline from Qatar to Eastern Europe that has to pass through Syria. Syria is a liaison from West and East. You cannot do anything, you cannot take anything from West to East without going through Syria. It's the gate to the world. It's been around for 8,000 years, and civilization started in Syria. That one main reason. It's the center of the world. That Qatari pipeline is the whole reason. In 2010, Assad refused to allow the Qatari pipeline to go through Syria. And this is what happened. If the Syrians said to the Qatari, yes, go ahead, pass your pipeline, World Banks would have been happy. This is a project in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So they wanted to capture plus you have offshore reserves right out of Syria today. All this needs to be passed through along to the World Banks. They need to profit from it. When Syria said no, this war had started. So we go back to Libya. The Libyan, you say, why did they do this, what they did in Libya? Obviously, if you count the 150 billions, and this is a small estimate, that Muammar Gaddafi and his people had in World Banks, how easy is it to take out that money by just taking that guy out?
Yeah, especially when he was planning to and was in the process of using it to gain African independence, basically.
Absolutely.
To construct, and that was not just we're going to lose the Middle East, we're going to lose Africa.
That's absolutely true. And at the same time, you hit two birds on one stone. You not only eliminate that threat, but at the same time, you have an economic crisis in Europe, and here comes $150 billion till today.
Right.
Nobody knows, and nobody will ever find out where that money went to. Right. No one will know, because this is the secret, Swiss accounts, banks, World Banks, a few people manage all that money. And that money is gone, 150 billion. Same money with Mubarak's money. Mubarak is gone, so did his 700 billion. I don't know how many billion. But the idea is war the profiteers of war are big nations, okay, from day one. Now, the Syrians survived. I think Syrian resisted. And I think this is the end of the reign of United States, 15 wars of trying to regime change in Syria. It's ending today. And that is all because the Syrians resisted. Yes, 200, 300,000 died, but they could have been in the millions if these people succeeded. The genocide that would have been carried out by these mercenaries who consider all Syrians are infidel. God forbid, if they had come to power, what would have happened to the Syrian? So yes, 300,000 died. It's a war carried out by multi-nations. Every mercenary in the world has entered Syria and carried the war. It's an invasion of terrorism against the country. We survived it, yes, at a huge cost, but we can still say we have this war. They were not able to kneel. Syria stayed strong, did not kneel. It's still going to stay and remain sovereign nation. And to us, that might be for the future. The future generation will thank us for being so resilient and for changing the course of the future of the Middle East, probably.
It was interesting too, the application of the Russian military assets at the time that they were applied. It came on, as you mentioned, it came on the heels of 15 months of NATO supposedly attacking ISIS, its child, and in the process of accomplishing in 5 months what NATO couldn't do in 15, supposedly, they exposed the operations of it. You had the aerial photography from the Russians of the truck pipeline, as President Putin called it. It was made clear that if things stopped moving between Turkey and ISIS, that ISIS would start to dry up, that its resources would dry up, and it was made clear that Turkey was heavily involved in trading oil on behalf of ISIS. And so that model has been exposed to the world, if not to the people in the United States.
Don, you hit it right on the money. The jokes flies out in Syrian. We on Facebook and then social media. We talk about another mistake by the American dropping of weapons to the rebel end up in the hand of ISIS.
Oops.
You have no idea how many mistakes, supposedly mistakes. This great army of ours, the strongest power in the world, who can actually listen on maybe Queen Elizabeth in her bedroom or listens to whatever's going on at the furthest point on earth, cannot hear few, leaders of ISIS talking in the middle of a desert. So many times they hit Syrian army points instead, dropped weapons to ISIS by mistake. This was just a big joke. We knew it from day one. This was coming in to actually lengthen the war, to weaken further the Syrian army. Let's just be frank, and I hope the listeners have now enough evidence to believe. I go back to this released report, intelligence report, that indicated that we know that these people who are fighting Assad are the Islamists, and we've used them in the past, and it's not a shameful anymore to the U.S. administration said, yes, these are people who are our foot soldiers. You just said it. Hillary Clinton said it before in a congressional hearing. Yes, these people we're fighting today are the same people we helped create and we funded, and they're doing it again. They will use these mercenaries from one area. They move them from Libya to Syria. Now they're moving them to Yemen, believe it or not. Right. These are foot soldiers, mercenaries that carry out, to help the interests of the West. But I want to make sure that the world understand that the source of this ideology, it's a fact that the global jihadist movement is linked directly and draw its inspiration from the state of Saudi Arabia. Let's just face it, that our main allies in the Middle East, the United States main ally in the Middle East, is the biggest human rights violator in the world. And these same human rights violator and supporters of this jihadist Wahhabist brand of Islam are the ones we're giving weapons to every year in the billions of dollars. Yeah. So let's just, you want to fight ISIS, but you don't want to fight the roots of ISIS. We know ISIS could not have grown on its own without billions of dollars support from someone.
Yeah, and let's take a break here and come back on that point. We'll be right back.